Hey everyone, welcome to our weekly chats. It's Tuesday again. Thanks for joining me, and thanks especially last week for some of the great comments and messages that were sent about our topic about that old iron bridge that's in Majors Park. That was a fun one, and apparently you agreed. And it's sort of a mystery that's been solved by a lot of folks questioning it, and because we were asking about it and talking about it, we were able to dig and find the answer. So if you missed last week, the great thing about Facebook is you can go back and right on this page and watch it, so they don't go anywhere. I keep them all up there. This week's topic came about from my research. And I realized as I was researching and completing the article, which will appear in this week's Easter Advertiser, and we also have an exhibit at the Municipal Center. The historian's office has an exhibit at the Municipal Center um, on the circle, the history of the circle, which interestingly has not always been a circle, and it's been a lot of different shapes, triangles, ovals, and so if you want to learn more about that, that's been fun. That was the topic of the exhibit. We moved the exhibit to the Municipal Center, but it originated at the Erie County Fair last year, so you may have seen it there in the historical building. But it was a fun thing to research and a fun thing to present, the different shapes of the circle. But as I was researching that, many of us don't realize because we call it the circle in East Aurora, and I find it interesting that traffic engineers, when they were actually talking about reconstructing Main Street about 15 years ago, they kept referring to the circle as the roundabout, and everybody in the room kept looking at each other. They couldn't figure out what the guy was talking about, and we're like, "Oh, we here in East Aurora call it the circle," and everyone had a good laugh about it. But also, it's not really technically called the circle, even though that's what we call it down at the west end of the village. It's called Willink Square, and that got me thinking because I get quite asked a lot, where in the heck did this name Willink come from? Um, the answer is it's a name that goes all the way back to the beginning of the settlement here in Western New York, not just East Aurora. And it's a name we just can't seem to shake, even though, in my opinion, we probably should shake it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit, try to answer that question as to where this name Willink came from. And it goes back to the late 1700s, early 1800s, and the treaties between the American Indian communities and the United States government. Um, I won't talk into those details because that's a whole nother discussion. But those treaties ended up giving control of basically all of Western New York to what a company in the Netherlands called the Holland Land Company. And they were given control of it. And of course, that's another presentation as well, another discussion as to the backstory on how a company from the Netherlands got control of United States government land that was ceded by the Native Americans. That's a whole other discussion. However, uh, the settlers were coming into Western New York, and the Holland Land Company surveyed all of Western New York and divided the Western New York into towns and lots and ranges. Surveyed actually Transit Road, which is at the western end of the town of Aurora. That was one of the transit lines that divided the towns, and that was a survey line, and that they put a road on it at one point. So the Holland Land Company was surveying, and they came up with these towns, which were not as how we see towns today. Towns were large strips of land, surveys actually, that stretched from the Lake Ontario down to the Pennsylvania border. And the Holland Land Company, as they were naming these, they were actually giving them numbers. And each of the lots had numbers, each of the towns had numbers, each of the range, and it was a grid. But then when it came time to give them a name, um, they came up with some names that were uh, related to Western New York. The town of Erie was one of them, but other communities they named after themselves. And the Holland Land Company named a lot of things after themselves, and the names have stuck. One of them being Ellicott and Ellicottville. Those were named after a person who's involved in the Holland Land Company. And the another one was the town of Willink. Willink, and it was named after Wilhelm Willink. And if you Google his name or research his name, you'll see several different spellings of his first name, but Willink, Willink. And so the town that the village of East Aurora and the town of Aurora is in today was in the town of Willink, which stretched from Lake Ontario all the way down to the Pennsylvania border. And as more settlers came in, the towns got smaller and smaller and renamed. Well, we stayed as part of Willink. We were the last four towns today standing in the town of Willink. So by the time we got to 1817, 1818, the town of Willink was what is today Aurora, Holland, Wales, and Colden. And then in 1818, they split, and the town of Willink no longer existed as a town. However, when the Postal Service was naming post offices, well before this, they naturally picked the name Willink. So even though the town of Willink went out of existence in 1818, 1819, it was it's a little technicality that I like to bring up, but 1818 is when the state approved it, and it went into effect in 1819. But the Willink post office remained in the town of Aurora. So that name Willink continued on. Town of Willink no longer exists. Well, 1849 comes along, and at that point, we talked a few weeks ago about villages and how villages could form from a geographic area of people, a hamlet, who wanted to form their own government to tax themselves in order to provide services. So they would form a government that was smaller than the town government, called a village. Well, they wanted to do that here in East Aurora, and they named toward what is today the west end of the village. And they naturally picked, when they came to pick their name, the post office there was still named Willink, so they decided to name their village Willink. So you still had a post office named Willink and a village named Willink. No town of Willink. So that name continued on there. Well, the next year, 1850 comes along, and the Postal Service splits the post office because it had served the entire area, and it was tough for people at the east end of the village to get to the west end, and they were complaining. So the Postal Service decided to split the Willink post office into two, came up with two new names, West Aurora and East Aurora. And that didn't work out so well. That was in 1850 because you had the West Aurora post office in the village of Willink. So after a couple years, they went back to the Willink name. Again, here we go. We can't seem to shake the Willink name. So in 1854 and beyond, we had the village of Willink and the post office of Willink within the town of Aurora. So the Willink name stayed. Fast forward to the 1870s, there was a movement to extend the boundaries of the village of Willink, which was just at the west end, to include the east end. And very long story short, they voted to extend the boundaries and then voted on a name, whether to retain the Willink name or to take the East Aurora name, which was what the hamlet was at the other end. And the voters of the village voted to take the name East Aurora by a margin of 19 votes. So the Willink name disappears as a village, and we become East Aurora. However, the post office remains Willink, and until 1913. So you had two post offices, remember, at either end of town. So you had the village of East Aurora, and you had the East Aurora post office on the east end and the Willink post office on the west end until 1913. The automobile came along. It became easier for people to get from one end of the village to the other. So the Postal Service decides to merge the post office. The post office that they had originally had all one and split, they merged back together, and they named it East Aurora after the village that it's in. That's the point where the name Willink seems to finally disappear. For a moment. So 1913, the village is gone of Willink, the town of Willink is gone, and the post office of Willink is gone. 1913. Well, fast forward to 1932, and the circle wasn't a circle yet. You can read all about that in this week's Advertiser. But there were two triangles down at that end of town, and it was a town square. and they had just called it the West End or the intersection and or the town square down at the West End, and a village board member came up with the idea that he wanted to officially name it a square. So he picked and pushed and forwarded the name Willink Square. Um, and the village board voted on it, and he had talked about how he had sort of had great memories of that name, having lived in the village of Willink at one point, and that the West End had kind of never really lost that name because of the post office. So they named the circle, what today is the circle, which was built in 1936, so 4 years later. But in 1932, they named it Willink Square, voted on it, the village board made it official. So it forever has been Willink Square since then, and so a name that we had finally shaken was now back as an official name, and it is official. So if you go into the village code books or the village laws, they'll actually talk about parking restrictions on Main Street, and it'll be measured from Willink Square. So they'll say so many yards from Willink Square, which is kind of interesting. So they still call it Willink Square. They don't call it the Circle. Now, this intrigues me because I'm intrigued and sort of annoyed a little bit that they couldn't shake the Willink name, that people held on to that name, and we actually still have it officially in the village code book. And there's a business down at that end of the town named after Willink that took that name. And the reason I say that is it's a neat name. However, Wilhelm Willink, the Holland Land Company agent, now he was a very wealthy a businessman from the Netherlands, and he was a principal and an investor in this Holland Land Company. He never, as far as we can tell, never stepped foot in this community. So, and he never, beyond being a landlord, never did anything for this community. And in fact, by the 1830s, local governments and the state government were really getting upset with the Holland Land Company, and they were trying to actually push them out. And it actually succeeded in a way because they were considered absentee landlords, and a lot of people were not. A lot of the people who had owed money to that company, this faraway company that had agents here, but really didn't. Besides making a lot of money and opening up roads and things like that, it wasn't like that Wilhelm Willink was the mayor or volunteering for charities here in East Aurora. He was nobody ever met him. Nobody ever knew him. So to me, it's really intriguing to me that every time we seem to shake the name, for instance, after the post office closed, someone came along later and decided to, they wanted to rename the circle Willink Square, and that name is still on the books. And that's very intriguing to me that we still hold on to that Willink name. However, a lot of people see that name Willink either in our history or on a business in town or me talking about it, and they don't understand. And sometimes I forget that name is connected to a part of our history, the early settlement and the landowners, and a period of time that was quite controversial. Yet again, a very more interesting discussion would be and maybe we can talk about that, is how on earth a company from the Netherlands and these rich investors who were already rich to begin with got control of all this land here in Western New York, and that we kept naming our town after, and our post office and all these things after one of those agents who again never set foot here. So that is where the name Willink came from and why we still seem to hold on to that name. So when you see the name Willink in history books or me talking about it, that's where it came from, and it originated back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and with a very wealthy businessman who never set foot here. So I hope that answers your question, and thanks again for all the comments and the discussion. Next week, I think, because I've been kind of waiting for this topic to come up, and this is just a little teaser. So the coronation in England of I almost said Prince Charles, King Charles III, takes place in May, and next week will be the week before that. And we have some very interesting connections to royalty, the British royalty here in East Aurora, two in particular. So we're going to talk about that next week. We did have the King of England at one point, the royal couple, come through East Aurora. So I'll leave that with you. And if you want to know more, join us next week. Thanks again for joining us. And again, just a little caveat, this project that I do, these videos, it's all on my own time, so not connected with the town of Aurora, my position as town historian. And again, if you have any comments, questions, please pop them in there. And if you're not following the page, please do, because that'll help you keep up to date on all the topics and all the videos. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.